Good afternoon or good morning, everyone, depending on where you are. Welcome to the fourth and final part of our webinar series between NACO and Esri on the American Rescue Plan and the various funding streams and capabilities included in that plan for counties and local governments. My name is Jack Peterson. I'm NACO's Director of Strategic Relations, and I'm pleased to have with us on the webinar today two experts in these fields. The first is Seamus Dowdle, who is on the NACO team and will cover all things broadband for us to start things off. And secondly, Richard Ledbeater, who is the Government Industry Solutions Manager for Esri. Just one housekeeping note: on the right-hand side of your screen, you should see two boxes. One is a questions box, and the second is a chat box. And you can use either of those to interact with us throughout the course of the day. But please go ahead and put your questions and other comments in the chat, and our speakers will respond to those after both of their presentations. With that, I'm going to go ahead and get things started by handing it off to Seamus, and Seamus, we'll let you take it from here.
Great, thank you so much, Jack, and hello, everybody. My name is Seamus Dowdle, as Jack mentioned, and I serve as a legislative associate who focuses specifically on broadband issues on our government affairs team. So what I'm here to talk about today is the American Rescue Plan Act's different funds in terms of broadband investments in infrastructures. So for today's conversation, I want to break it down into a few different sections. We'll essentially start by talking about the direct funding opportunities to counties that are made available by the American Rescue Plan Act, that's specifically within the Fiscal Recovery Funds program. We will then run through the main non-direct funding opportunities that have been enacted under the bill. This will specifically include the Emergency Connectivity Fund that is administered by the Federal Communications Commission. And then lastly, I want to speak a bit about current opportunities for funding outside of these two buckets. This will be a few different programs that I want to give an overview on. So first, with the direct funding under the American Rescue Plan Act, we will start with the coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery funds. So what this program does is it provides $362 billion for eligible state, local, territorial, and tribal governments. This is in direct response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And within this $362 billion pool of funds, counties are receiving $65.1 billion in direct aid. So part of what NACO's mission has been is to be as responsive as possible in terms of the direct aid that counties are receiving. So in those efforts, what you see on your screen here is NACO's Resource Center. You're welcome to use this link to visit our center, but we've essentially compiled a lot of different resources on what counties can do with the fiscal recovery funds, different FAQ resources, as well as county investment plans. So how counties are actually taking these funds and using them within their communities. So within the program, I first want to give an overview of some main eligible uses within the Fiscal Recovery Funds program. There are a variety of ways in which localities can use these funds as a response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So I want to run through a few of these kind of high-level allowable uses before doing more of a deep dive into broadband investments in infrastructure. So what you'll see on your screen here, first things first, the funds are eligible to be used to support the public health response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So this can include efforts such as funding COVID-19 mitigation efforts, different medical expenses, behavioral health care, and then funding salaries and benefits for certain public health and safety staff that are responding directly to the pandemic. Secondly, the funds can be used to address the different negative economic impacts that have been borne as a result of the pandemic. So in terms of allowable uses here, this can be assistance directly to individuals, households, small businesses, as well as impacted industries and the public sector more broadly. And we have a lot of great resources on NACO's resource hub that outlines how specifically the statute outlines funds can be used in this manner. The third use would be replacing public sector revenue loss. So within the Fiscal Recovery Funds program, funds can be used to provide government services at the local level up to the extent in which a locality may have lost revenue due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Fourthly, funds can be used to provide premium pay to essential workers. So this is a pretty broad category in terms of what the Treasury Department determines as essential, but they're really looking for workers that were in person throughout the COVID-19 pandemic and thus at a higher risk of contracting COVID-19. Within the Fiscal Recovery Funds program, recipients of the funds are allowed to essentially administer a premium paid to these essential employees that worked in some of these critical infrastructure areas. A fifth use of the funds would be in water and sewer infrastructure. So these are two areas that the statute specifically outlined as critically important to be invested in throughout the pandemic. And the outlined eligible uses here pretty closely aligns to EPA guidance around clean water and drinking water for water and sewer infrastructure. And then lastly, of course, the focus for our time today is in broadband infrastructure. So the statute outlines with some in-depth detail the investments that are able to be made in order to provide unserved and underserved locations with new or expanded broadband access. So let's talk a little bit more about that broadband infrastructure section of the Fiscal Recovery Funds. And what I want to do is outline 4 major uses in terms of these funds for broadband infrastructure. So first things first, broadband deployment is covered within the Fiscal Recovery Funds program. And essentially, covered broadband projects are going to need to focus on unserved and underserved households and businesses. Areas meeting this criteria are defined as lacking a broadband speed of 25 megabytes per second download and 3 megabytes per second upload. And in terms of how these deployment projects can be handled, it's important to note that although the focus needs to be on unserved and underserved households and businesses, they do not need to be the only ones who are receiving broadband service by any project under this program. So as long as the broadband project is at least partially serving unserved and underserved households and businesses, then the project is considered eligible. Secondly, I wanted to talk about the speed requirements that a project will need to satisfy in order to be eligible under the Fiscal Recovery Funds. So all covered broadband projects are expected to be designed to deliver, upon their completion, a symmetrical upload and download speed of 100 megabytes per second. And you'll notice I have an asterisk there next to that requirement. There is an exception that is being made simply to acknowledge the reality that there are some localities and counties that have areas where it may be topologically or geographically difficult to implement broadband connection that will be able to satisfy these speeds. So in those circumstances where 100 and 100 speeds may be difficult, the requirement instead is that the download speed is up to 100 megabytes per second, but the upload speed reaches 20 megabytes per second. So there is that exception, but if you are not in a location where it is geographically or topologically difficult to implement that project, the 100 symmetrical is expected. Third, I wanted to talk about last mile and middle mile broadband infrastructure. So there is an emphasis within the Fiscal Recovery Funds program when it relates to broadband infrastructure that there be a focus on last mile connections, but middle mile connection can be constructed as well. So I want to talk about those two terms quickly, and we can start with middle mile. So the definition of middle mile is really any broadband infrastructure that does not connect directly to a household or a business. This can include a wide variety of technologies, whether we are talking about fiber, going underneath water, land, going between different data centers. This is really the backbone of the broadband internet connection that we see across all households and businesses, but they're not directly connected to households households and businesses. The last mile, on the other hand, is going to be up to the point in which an internet connection formally reaches a household or a business. So it is connected to the middle mile, but it essentially serves the distance between the middle mile and the household or the business. So this is a very crucial area as it relates to broadband connection. This is oftentimes where the connection can be thinnest, and things such as user traffic can significantly impact the speed of that connection. So this is certainly an emphasis of the Fiscal Recovery Funds program and where they hope to direct funds, but you do have the ability to construct last mile as well as middle mile. And then lastly, wanted to touch on affordability. So the fiscal recovery funds do include language to support affordable options for consumers as it relates to broadband access. And the statute does note that there is encouraged support for broadband networks that are owned, operated by, or affiliated with local governments, nonprofits, and co-ops. In addition to the broadband infrastructure use cases we just outlined in the steps there, broadband investments are also considered eligible when they are addressing a negative economic impact. So I want to talk a little bit about this as it's a little outside of broadband infrastructure itself. But the first way in which broadband investments can be made is via household assistance. So utility assistance is a covered expense under the fiscal recovery funds. So one way that aid can be met on the broadband side is perhaps by providing relief to certain residents in the form of utilities. Secondly, digital literacy is covered within the fiscal recovery funds. So as a response to the pandemic, funds being spent to promote digital literacy and uptake rates within communities would be an eligible use. So getting more potential consumers to sign up in light of the pandemic's realities. Oftentimes we are working in a telework setting or going to school remotely. So these efforts can be used to promote more interaction and uptake with broadband services. And then lastly, kind of goes hand in hand with digital literacy, internet accessibility is another area in which funds can be spent. So, this of course can be expanded broadband deployment, but it could also include access to connective devices and Wi-Fi hotspots in public areas, as well as some other uses. So at a high level, overall, these are the eligible expenses that we just went through. As under Treasury's interim final rule, counties and localities will be able to invest in broadband infrastructure that are going to support those unserved and underserved communities. So in summary, that can include broadband deployment, connecting the last mile, as well as the middle mile. And an eligible use can also include pre-project development. So if your county is in a position where you are still determining how to best make an impact in terms of broadband infrastructure, as a part of an eligible use of the funds, you may conduct pre-project planning and different development studies to identify communities that may fall within one of these two buckets of unserved or underserved. You can also begin to scope out construction costs and different assessments as you prepare for deployment. So all of those steps along the way are also included as an eligible use. And then, as I mentioned, digital literacy training, internet accessibility and affordability. And then lastly, I didn't mention this before, but modernization of cybersecurity. This can include hardware, software, and other protection of critical infrastructure, particularly at the local government level. So kind of modernizing county offices or different departments' cybersecurity infrastructure will also be covered as an eligible expense. So wanted to touch through a few different, frequently asked questions that the Treasury Department, as well as we get on broadband infrastructure use of funds. And I've just highlighted a few here, but there are certainly more, and we encourage you to go to NACO's FAQ website if you do have questions. But the first one you see here is, how do you know if a broadband project is an eligible use of funds, and does a county need pre-approval? And the answer to this question is, first, recipients do not need pre-approval from Treasury to determine whether an investment is eligible. So once the county has done the work to identify unserved and underserved communities will be reached by their project, and that reach will be a focus of the project, you essentially are permitted to move forward with the project as it being eligible under the Fiscal Recovery Funds program. So there is no pre-approval or application process. Once you have the funds, you are able to move forward with that project. Another question we get often is, for broadband infrastructure investments, what is the requirement to reliably meet or exceed a broadband speed threshold mean? And the Treasury Department uses this word in two ways. So the first is they are using it to identify the areas that are eligible to be the subject of broadband infrastructure investments. And then secondly, reliably is used to identify expectations for acceptable service levels for broadband investments funded by the Fiscal Recovery Funds. And then this third question here, may funds be used to build or upgrade broadband connections to schools and libraries? The answer is yes here. You've probably heard me say a few times that households and businesses are the kind of recipients of this broadband service, but Treasury defines business quite broadly. This can be everything such as private businesses and institutions that serve the public, to schools, libraries, healthcare facilities, and really anchor institutions more broadly, and then public safety organizations. And then I wanted to share a few county stories that we have heard so far in terms of the use of fiscal recovery funds for broadband infrastructure. These are a few counties that we kind of selected from our county investment plans database. This is a resource that I encourage everyone on the call to take a look into on NACO's website. We have over 250 investment plans on that database right now. We plan on continuing to grow that database. But I'll just highlight a few counties here quickly and apologize if the font is a little small. But Alachua County in Florida first is investing $15 million to broadband infrastructure. And their project is currently under development, but essentially they are hoping to collaborate with cities within the county, school boards, colleges, and the University of Florida's college system in particular to maximize the impact of providing broadband to underserved and unserved communities within their county. And they also want to prioritize addressing internet affordability and accessibility gaps. Another county using funds for broadband would be Anoka County in Minnesota. This county is allocating $3.1 million to provide a matching grant opportunity to different cities and townships within the county for any project that's going to provide broadband expansion to unserved and underserved areas within that community. Bell County, Texas is another one. They haven't specified the level in their investment yet, but they are hoping to focus on the digital infrastructure within their community. And they've actually conducted planning meetings with all the jurisdictions within Bell County to ensure that that project is successful. And I know that they'll be having more details soon. And then Broward County, Florida is also investing $1 million in broadband access. So there are a variety of different counties that have already moved forward with broadband infrastructure. And as I mentioned, encourage everyone to take a look at our database there. So next, I want to switch gears a little bit here and talk about some non-direct funding opportunities in the American Rescue Plan Act. And we're going to focus mainly on the Emergency Connectivity Fund. So this is a $7.17 billion program authorized under the American Rescue Plan. And the Emergency Connectivity Fund, or ECF, essentially reimburses schools and libraries for reasonable costs of eligible equipment and broadband connections used to help students, staff, and patrons who otherwise would lack access to be able to engage in remote learning. So this is a direct response to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, taking school into a remote setting and forcing, many families to have to connect from their homes and really rely on an internet service or broadband connection that may not be strong enough to support one or even multiple kids trying to connect to their classrooms. And this program so far has administered just about half of the available funds to grantees who have applied. I do want to note that the application windows for this program are currently closed, but if funds remain after the second application window, which was just completed, if funds do remain after the fact, they will open up a third application window. So this is a program to keep an eye on. And additional funds are also being considered by Congress for a slight extension to the program too. But I essentially want to run through just real quickly who is eligible for this program and then who can receive the benefits of it. So as I mentioned, all schools and libraries are eligible, and they're actually automatically eligible if they already receive E-rate funding. But schools, on the school side, this will include all public and even private K through 12 schools. And on the library side, if they are getting support from the Library Services and Technology Act in terms of funding, then they will be eligible for this program. And then recipients of the benefit of this program, so once the schools and libraries have it, they are essentially able to provide benefits to all K through 12 students, library patrons, and educators that are engaging in remote learning. And in terms of what schools and libraries can provide to these students, patrons, and educators, on the equipment side, they are able to provide everything from certain dollar amounts for laptops and tablet computers to Wi-Fi hotspots, modems, routers, and even devices that combine the two. And then on the services side, this program is able to provide commercially available internet access services that'll provide a fixed or mobile broadband internet access connection for any off-campus use by students, school staff, or patrons. So the support amounts in terms of what this is looking like, applicants can ask for up to $400 for each connected device, and then up to $250 for each Wi-Fi hotspot provided to a student, staff, or patron. So that's essentially an overview of the ECF program. As I mentioned, the application window is closed at the moment, but over $3.2 billion in funds have already been dispersed, and I think over 1,000 grantees have benefited from this directly at this point. And so we're excited to see how many more awards are granted with the second application window. And lastly, this is really the last kind of main slide I have in terms of additional open funding opportunities. And this does fall a little bit out of the American Rescue Plan, but I would be remiss not to mention the program, and that is the Rural E-Connectivity Program, otherwise known as Reconnect. So essentially, what the Reconnect program does is it furnishes loans and grants to provide funds for the cost of construction, improvement, or acquisition of facilities and equipment needed to provide broadband service in eligible rural areas. So this is a rural focused program, but they are at their highest funding level yet. They have $1.15 billion in discretionary grants available within the program. And this application window is open for rural areas. So the portal opened on November 24th, and the deadline to apply for grant and or loan funds is February 22nd of next year. The year is wrong on that slide, but it'll be of 2022. So we have another 2 months to apply for this program. And essentially, the threshold that they are looking at for this program, what is deemed sufficient access to broadband, is going to be 100 megabytes downstream or download and 20 megabytes upload. So 120 is going to be the threshold that they want to reach with this program. So it's partially in line with the fiscal recovery funds. The fiscal recovery funds do have that symmetrical line. But this is just another important program that we wanted to get on everybody's radar. And then the last thing I'll mention before I essentially go to my last slide is also that the recently passed bipartisan infrastructure bill is going to have a lot of very critical broadband funds that will be implemented over the next year. It'll be in the coming years, in fact. The funds total almost $48 billion in broadband funds. Again, a little outside of the American Rescue Plan in our presentation today, but that will include everything from broadband deployment funds to additional middle mile infrastructure funds, as well as programs dedicated to digital equity and ensuring that all residents have equal access to the internet. So we have additional resources on NACO's website pertaining to that new bipartisan infrastructure bill. We encourage folks to take a look, and happy to share a link in the chat or have our staff do so. But there are certainly more broadband funds coming down the pike from that bill as well. Oh, and I'll mention too, we do have our upcoming legislative conference, NACO's legislative conference in Washington, D.C. in the first half of February from the 12th to the 16th. We're going to be having some specific programming on broadband infrastructure. During that conference, we're going to have a workshop where we hope to feature several agency speakers and talk about all the funding opportunities in 2022. So we certainly encourage you to register for that conference if you haven't yet. And we'll have some great programming for that conference. And here is my contact information. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you do have any questions from NACO's end on broadband funding opportunities or programs. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. And with that being said, I believe I will be turning it over to my colleague, Richard, now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Seamus. Nice overview of all of the various funds, and I do say various funds. So, Seamus, as Seamus explained, there are many. It's quite confusing how many different programs are out there. We get a lot of news about the various programs, and we think that's it. But as pointed out, and as detailed quite well on the NACO website, there's a number of opportunities. I want to pick the Infrastructure Investment Act as one example of the non-direct funding that is available. The Act itself has over 380 mentions of broadband. Okay, the image on the side is just one part of that Act that's dealing with the broadband in particular, but over 380 mentions of how it can be used, where it can be used, what it can be used for, and it's quite broad in its nature. It can be, as long as you were supporting, as Seamus pointed out, as long as we're supporting communities of need, communities at risk of being left behind, communities that need more, students who should be going to school and are not. That's the criteria in a very vague term. But fundamentally, through the Jobs Act, there's 5 eligible programs that you can shuffle through to help fund expansion of broadband. And that link is active, and you'll be getting these slides at the end. I want to just take a step back for those non-GIS people on the call and say why. Why are we talking geography? Broadband is out there. Don't they know? Don't they know where? Well, typically no. I've covered National Association of Counties for many years now, and election people know their territory from when they ran. It's grown. Populations have shifted, as the 2020 census tell us. So things are always different, and knowing where broadband expansion needs to occur. where you need to act is the challenge, and what Esri hopes to address in all of this. So I want to break down GIS. GIS is about four things, I like to say. It's about the data. It's about the data of your broadband and where it's located, where it's not, what homes are being served, what homes are being underserved, being able to locate that data and bring in supplemental data. We'll talk about that as I get through some of the applications, but to know some of the demographics, socio-demographics about your community and be able to determine where they live, where people who have it live, where people who don't have it and need it live, as well as bring in other data where you're spending money. Spatial analysis, bringing those data sets together to do analysis, to get answers, to eke answers out of that raw material of the data, to provide better insight into your decision making. Of course, insight is needed, but you also need to present it, and that's where the applications come in. Applications to engage not only the public, but to applications to present your findings, to also facilitate the communication internally within the government, within the county government, to address how this money will be spent, where it was spent, and what are the priorities. Of course, the maps. I like to think of maps as containers, as data products into themselves. Maps are a wonderful container for not only the data, the spatial analysis, but how you convey that so that it's understandable to the elected officials and to the public and those people making the decisions on spending those broadband dollars. In our work for this, in trying to explain broadband solutions to both GIS practitioners, but to elected officials and government leaders in general, I like to break it down into these four areas. It's the engineering. Yeah, we need to bury the line. We need to know about the capacity. We need to know what the engineering and infrastructure requirements are to deliver that 100 megabits down the pipe. That leads us to the civic engagement. How do we tell the public we're doing something? How do we engage them in involved and let them comment on our plans, make suggestions, but communicate where the ultimate federal funds are going to be spent and establish that communication? Ultimately, this gives you the ability to address the equity issues. Where are the people who need it versus where are the people who have it? Where are the people who want it? All of these are able to be eked out through the demographic data of the Census Bureau, but your own data of not only what the providers give you and where lines are buried and not, but where do you need to grow? All of this goes into economic mobilities, ensuring that the businesses in your community are able to grow, they're able to sustain themselves, but the people, are they able to sustain themselves as well? Do your students who go to schools have access to this in case they're shut out from the physical building again? Do the schools have the adequate access to be able to teach in this modern day? I like to say broadband is the economic development data layer. We used to talk about roads and highways and all sorts of other infrastructure, but fundamentally it's broadband. If you want to attract people, if you want to attract business, if you want to grow the economy of your community, broadband is the first thing you need to think about. In this thinking, we've found that our users are thinking in various categories, and I offer this slide as a way to understand how you go about understanding your community, identifying your priorities, and communicating that funding and communicating the results and engagement of the civics. First is the validate. Where do people have broadband access and what is the capacity? Everybody knows about the broadband maps or should know about the broadband maps. They were built quite some time ago now, and they were built with some various levels of rounding errors, I'll call it. And that data, it was good and bad. It didn't particularly define who actually had it. It did a better job of showing you broad areas. So being able to launch an app, as we talked about, that allows citizens to tell you where they are and also communicate what the broadband capacities are in. We have a product called Survey 123 that's being used today, where communities are putting this out to the public and they're able to report their broadband access. This ties into the NACO tested app as well. Then doing the analysis, doing the spatial analysis to identify where the priority investment areas should be and can be. We have populations that need internet. Can we actually physically build it there? Being able to do that kind of analysis can be quite complex, especially when we try to add those elements of equity into our modeling. And then securing the funding, telling the feds, telling NTIA, telling the FCC where you want to spend the money, how you're going to spend the money, but also communicating to your citizens and getting their input, creating those portals, as it were, to manage both the build out and the communication with the stakeholders and the residents. I offer this as a bunch of examples. These are all examples from Esri's user base. These were submitted by users on various aspects of broadband build out, planning, coverage calculations. And you can see that the variety there's quite a variety of how GIS plays a role in the analysis and understanding and the engineering and the build out and the communication of where it is needed and how to deliver it. More examples, LiDAR, where's the LiDAR, where's the cell, how do I calculate when I do build out cell towers, who do they communicate to? Is that the right population? Looking at labor sheds, when we think about watersheds, well, here's the idea of where are the jobs, where are the people who have those skills, where are the people that need those jobs, and being able to model those, but model them in terms of providing the broadband. Where I have businesses growing, do I have adequate broadband? Where I have people with skill sets, do they have access to the broadband? If I want to attract people into my jurisdiction, to my county, one thing they need is access to broadband. NTIA uses the GIS technology, uses Esri technology to do their planning as well. You know, you'll be hearing more in the coming months about updating the broadband map, as it were. All the way to building out the fiber and trying to plan where it is. As I alluded to, broadband is economic development. It is where people are going to move to. It is where businesses will grow. So this is definitely part of your economic development. If your economic director is not involved in your broadband discussions, they need to be. They need to be, because they need to understand where the economy is and isn't going to grow because of the infrastructure that can be provided. All this is a pretty long way of saying that GIS is a system of workflows and content. It is the way to leverage all of the data of record, the data that the government owns, the county owns, about the assessors, the people that live in there in your county. It's your system of engagement, as I said, communicating with the citizens, but in communicating internally with your own workforce. Have them go collecting data as they do their job and being able to transform it back into the corporate data assets so that you can do the proper analysis and planning. But it's the system of insight, being able to do the right kind of analysis so that you can understand. Better understanding allowing you to act more efficiently and to act better when you're planning out your digital divide. There are plenty of solutions on the Esri webpage that are useful for helping you figure out the broadband needs, capacities, and where to build out. And these links are live. They'll take you to a series of story maps and hub sites where you can find different applications that help you build out, that help you understand, that help you communicate. These are 6 such applications that are free to our users. It's code that's meant to be modified. It's pre-programmed, it's maintained, and it's meant to be that jumpstart to allow you to send out an application that allows you to test the Ookla speed and communicate that back, as well as communicate out to the public. Both the Donna County and Loudoun County apps are just that, showing where potential projects are going to be to the community and allow them to communicate. Yeah, this is good, this is bad, it needs to be different, or just confirmation that it's good. The Hawaii broadband dashboard is an internal looking dashboard allowing the governor of that state to see where the applications for the federal money are happening and where the potential build out of and spend of those dollars will ultimately be. All the way to agriculture, understanding broadband and precision agriculture. That's often a community we leave out. Farmers, in order to be the most efficient, need broadband access to run their farms, to connect to their machinery, to know when to plant, to understand the weather. The USDA has a lot of funds, some of them Seamus mentioned, to augment broadband in rural communities. I don't want to leave that out. It's an important aspect of the funding. And here are some story maps. These are made by our user community. That there's a tribal broadband use where it's going out, allowing tribal residents to test and measure and prove the access that they have. But more importantly, the schools. Where are the school children? Now that they're not reporting into the school system, do they even have access to be able to engage? The USDA Broadband Reconnect program, as I mentioned, being able to spend in rural communities for their needs that are similar but sometimes different than more suburban or urban communities. And then the Loudoun County Broadband Analysis. Come on. More content in the story map form. But this is a document written by one of my peers, Patrick Ryan, talking about the systematic approach, the system approach to broadband mapping, and how do you determine the data you need and make sense of it? How do you determine the data that is pertinent to these federal programs that's needed to apply? And ultimately build out your own broadband map so that you can make your analysis and defend where it needs to be. We've all seen those big chloropleth maps, color fill maps that show access or not. This is the same data. This is the same kind of map, but with a little bit of a twist. Those big maps that show wide areas, and especially in the rural counties of low broadband access, those can be confusing. What we've done here is a very simple analysis of just showing building footprints, both commercial and residential, and then relaying that data that way, so that you can see in communities and areas of your county where you don't have people living, you don't have to worry about the buildup. So it helps streamline that idea of where you have broadband access and not where you have need. Seeing those pink building footprints in areas surrounded by green lets you know that those are easy. Those are easy to address. The build out isn't as big as these big broad areas that might otherwise show up when you're doing more simplistic cartographic products. To come back to this slide, this was all done through apps. These apps are available, whether it's the Survey 123, whether it's some analysis to help you identify priority areas, and apps to help you communicate internally and externally and with your partners of where broadband is going to have to grow. I would be remiss and not talk about addressing equity and social justice with broadband. These are applications that allow you to augment your analysis of the build out, the engineering analysis of where broadband is and isn't, and being able to add that lens, that equity lens to your analysis to communicate better, to serve better your entire community. Again, this is census data, demographic and statistical data. that are being used by counties in their analysis of broadband. And it's quite varied, all the way from registered voters. I mean, where are my voters? If we ever get to internet voting, will they even be able to be served? Maricopa is asking questions like that. All the way to population and employment mixes, internet speed maps. Where's my population changing? How fast is it growing or shrinking in these various areas? All the way to mapping historical scars in our counties and cities where that occurred because of redlining. Being able to address those areas in particular. Have I caught up from the 1960s? Have those areas been addressed or not? But being able to see them helps users understand where to go with their analysis and how to address disadvantaged neighborhoods. This is a screenshot of the USDA's Reconnect websites. I just wanted to show you these because there is some mapping on these sites as well to be able to identify key focus areas of the USDA where they want to support with additional funds eligible growth of broadband in these particular areas. I encourage you to go to this link and look for your communities and see where within your counties USDA is looking to spend their grant dollars. And finally, maps for public policy. Again, this is a link that allows you to get to some pre-cooked maps, some maps that have been addressed with an eye toward cartography to be able to show this data set. There are hundreds of data sets within this policy site, and they help you build the case, help you find the data that you need to put into your analysis, build the case, share those data sets, and get the discussion going on what data is needed and what data is available to you. And I'll close with a discussion about, it's all about where. Where is it the need? Where is there justification? And where do I act? Maps are essential in finding out that place of biggest impact that services the right community the right way in the most expedient expenditure of money and time. With that, we'll be on for the next few minutes. We'll be able to take some questions. Please use the application to type questions into the text box. We offer you these sites as well. These slides will be made available to you so you can visit them after the webinar. With that, are there any questions?
Thanks, Richard. I've got, I think, one question for each of you, or perhaps a question that you both two questions you both may want to respond to. So, Seamus, I think we'll start with you. There is a question in the chat about the sort of specific eligibility of equipment, so computers and mobile devices and things like that. And I think sort of similarly, there was a sort of question, and Richard, you mentioned this at the end, that we would share some of these slides, but there's a question about, is there a chart somewhere for sort of figuring out which federal fund to use for which piece of various types of broadband infrastructure? And I'd be curious, Seamus, your insight on, what NACO has available, but also what else might be out there in the world. So Seamus, why don't we start with you on those two?
Sure. So in terms of the equipment that's available, and I assume this is under the Emergency Connectivity Fund, there are a variety of different equipment purchases that can be made using those funds, and that can include, laptop and tablet computers, modems and routers that may need to be used in the home to connect to classes, Wi-Fi hotspots. So this is kind of if you're on the go, but you need to connect, you're able to do so with that technology, and then really any device that's combining the two. So those equipment pieces, can get up to $400 within the ECF, and have those funded through that program.
That's perfect. And then the question about sort of a chart or something that lays out all these different funding streams. What are your thoughts on that front?
Yeah, so NACO has a few resources as it relates to just the different broadband funds that are available. But I'll speak, first once again just to the Fiscal Recovery Funds program. NACO has a COVID-19 clearinghouse that really, in a detailed fashion, lays out where all the funds within that program are kind of laid out and where they go, as well as the eligible uses are kind of mapped out within that program. And in addition to the charts and resources that we have on that clearinghouse, if there is ever a question about an eligible use that you are curious to hear from our staff on, we actually have a direct question box that you can send to our staff, and we do our best to get back to you within around a few business days or so. But outside of the Fiscal Recovery Funds program, NACO does have a few resources on the emergency broadband funds that have come through, one of which is the ECF, of course. We have a few different resource pages that has the outline of eligibility around that program. And we also have information on programs such as the Emergency Broadband Benefit. That is a result of last year's funding bill, but that includes a full consumer benefit in the amount of $50 right now. It's about to move down a little bit in terms of monthly benefit. But we have those resources on our NACO website in terms of, I just saw the clearinghouse come through there, and then I will actually send over the link for the ECF and EBB programs in terms of additional broadband dollars. And then lastly, I did mention the infrastructure bill. NACO does have an analysis page on our website that breaks down the entirety of the bill, but we have a section dedicated to broadband and the different programs within that.
Perfect. Thank you, Seamus. And yes, would love if you could share some of those things in the chat. I just shared NACO's COVID clearinghouse in the chat as well, which does have that question box on it that Seamus referenced. Seamus and his team have answered over 2,000 questions from counties across the country already through that question portal. So certainly encourage you to share information there. Richard, I want to give you a chance to sort of respond and think some about how to think about threading some of these funding streams. And I know we shared a bunch of the resources NACO has, but as you all sort of look across the landscape and know that there are these different streams out there, what does Esri sort of think or see as the path for choosing which stream to use and figuring some of those pieces out?
Well, this is the layperson speaking, but I wouldn't get in a bunch about what stream and what program. There isn't a particular punch box. Yeah, that's the broadband money. Broadband is spread out through all of the grant funding programs. It's mentioned in the COVID response. It's mentioned in just about every program. Broadband is mentioned as a solution choice. So don't be intimidated. As long as you're serving a population of need, a population that has been disenfranchised, a population that has been underserved or affected by COVID. My reading of the requirements is pretty lenient. I don't see I see a lot of people bringing the lawyers into the room to read all the fine print, and my gut feeling is you don't need that much of a review of the criteria. They are being pretty broad in what you can spend it on and how you can spend it, as long as you can show that people are benefiting.
Thanks, Richard. Sort of speaking of the communities that sort of need increased resources or have been particularly impacted by COVID, we also had a chat come in about some of the USDA maps that you had referenced, and I'm wondering if you could just elaborate a little bit on some of those maps that are available. The question specifically was whether or not USDA has maps of Black-owned farms or formerly Black-owned farms, but I'd be curious if you could just sort of expand on the usability of those maps a little bit as well.
Sure. So the Living Atlas is a portal on the Esri.com website And we do quite a yeoman's work of collecting federal data sets, and USDA and other federal agencies. We work with them to get the data published and curated so that people can use it in their day-to-day. So visit the site, visit livingatlas.com, look for the data surrounding to keywords, broadband, whatever. Keyword is important to your kind of analysis, but I know the USDA is collecting a lot of data. I know that they have requirements to collect Black-owned farms and formerly Black-owned farms. I can't say myself whether that is actually matured to be a data layer, a map layer yet. I do know that there's plans. So that will be an important part of some of the funding, I know. So stay tuned, visit the Atlas, and give us a call if you know where data is and you don't see the corresponding map that helps your analysis.
Perfect. Thank you, Richard. Seamus and Richard, I want to say thank you again for joining us today, and just want to pause before we wrap up to see if either of you have any sort of final thoughts or comments, knowing that we will share these slides with attendees afterwards. So Seamus, why don't we start with you, and if you have any sort of final thoughts or comments to wrap up, that would be great.
Yeah, of course, happy to start. Yeah, wrap up thoughts, essentially within the Fiscal Recovery Funds program, really the intention in terms of broadband investments is to make, the use of those funds as broad as possible. So notwithstanding the speed requirements, Treasury is encouraging to begin using those funds, which are available now to begin investing in broadband. I mentioned the infrastructure bill and all of the broadband funds that are on the way with that legislation, but we're certainly months away from those funds being available, and then perhaps even a little bit further in terms of implementation. So with the fiscal recovery funds available now, I mentioned we have our county investment plans database. We've seen over 20 broadband project plans already come through, and we are sure there are more out there. So don't hesitate to come onto NACO's website, take a closer look at some of the resources we have and that we've collected across counties to see how folks are using those funds for infrastructure in the broadband space.
And I'll add to that. Remember, as Seamus described, there are direct funds and there are non-direct funds, and the non-direct funds are still flowing out. They're typically competitive or formula-based, but they are available through existing federal programs. So if you applied to the USDA for rural connectivity grants, guess what? That's how you get the new grant money coming out from USDA. So these are existing grant systems. Don't think that there's a new process that you have to get people up to speed on applying for. If you've applied for federal money before, this is how you're going to get the new stimulus money as well. The direct aid is cash that your counties should be availing themselves to now. Much of that is going to recouping from the economic downturn that may have occurred, but it's out there, it's available.
Perfect. Thank you, Richard. Seamus, thank you again as well. And thanks to everyone who joined us today. As I've said a couple of times, this will be made available after the fact. Thanks again to our partners at Esri for this great 4-part series to get this information out there. And we certainly encourage you all to reach out to Richard or Seamus or myself. Use the questions box on the NACO website, and please let us know if you have any questions. And certainly if you're from a county, we hope to see you next time you're in DC. Please feel free to stop by our office. So thanks so much, and we look forward to talking to you soon.
Thank you.